Currently, there are 143,000 special needs students in Washington State right now. That means in the public school system, about 13 or 14% of the total students have special needs. A student with special needs is someone that is evaluated as having an intellectual disability, a hearing impairment, including deafness, a speech or language impairment, a visual impairment, including blindness, a serious emotional disturbance, an orthopedic impairment, autism, traumatic brain injury, and other health impairment, a specific learning disability, deaf, blindness, or multiple disabilities, and by reason thereof, needs special education and related services. That definition is from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, as you can probably tell, that was a very long and lengthy definition that covers a very, very broad spectrum of disabilities. That means that if you try and take one student with a disability and try and match them with another student with a disability, they might not seem the same at all. It is a super broad category, and trying to treat each student as the same or as one kind of small fitting group is a very, very hard thing to do, which is why a movement called the full inclusion movement is a bad thing. Full inclusion forces special needs students into general education classrooms full time. What this means is that special education students are taken out of classrooms that are designed specifically for them and to meet their needs, and they are put in a general education classroom with other typical students. That means they are not going to get the same quality of teachers, they're not going to get the same quality of education, and the goals of their education are not going to be met as well. Special needs students already have a very good place in a special education classroom to be able to learn and grow and do what they need to do. So the main thing to focus on is that special needs students have a very large spectrum of abilities, and they cannot be designated as just one small group that you can throw anywhere you want and put them into any classroom environment. It simply doesn't work like that. One size doesn't fit all education. It's not going to work like that. But when talking about this, it is important to remember three things. It is not just the special education students that are hurt by this. It is also the teachers and the general education students as well. Full inclusive education is harmful to every party involved, not just the special needs students. So, talking about the first confirmation, we are going to talk about the most important group involved, and that is the special needs students. Obviously, the special needs students are going to be hurt when you put them in a general education classroom. Jane Sevier, a special needs researcher and writer, says that students with severe disabilities taught in special education classrooms outperform those with severe disabilities taught in general education classrooms. Plain and simple, it's stated that students with disabilities are going to do worse when they are put in an environment that does not work out best towards them. They aren't going to be able to do the same amount of work that they need to do. And while a special needs student's work is not going to look the same as a general education student's work, it is still very important that it has to get done. Special needs students use these things called IEPs. If you've never heard of one, it stands for Individualized Education Plan. It is something that is made between the teacher, the parent, and the school itself. It sets goals for the student, and it gives them reasonable things that they want to obtain during the school year. It is not the same as following a set curriculum of 10th or 11th grade standard material for a general education student. It looks different for each and every student. That's why it's individual. And the important thing is that if you take a special education student and put them into a general education classroom, either they're not going to be able to accomplish that IEP, or the goals in the IEP need to be lowered such that they can try and meet the expectations of just the reality that they're not going to be able to perform as well in that general education class. And that is a bad thing. You want your special needs student to be able to perform to their utmost ability and really fulfill their potential. But special needs students aren't in those classrooms aren't the only thing you need to focus about. You also need to focus about the general education students and mixing and mingling them. Because a lot of people who call for full inclusion want something in particular. They want the social environment of the school to be better. They think special needs students are set off in their own area and they aren't really included well in any of the school environment. They think that full inclusion will be able to bring the school together and unite them. Well, I'll talk more about the specifics on why that won't work later. One of the important things to realize is that you can include those special needs students with the current model that's being used through electives and through special interest classes. And how that's going to work is that electives can do either one of two things for you. You can either have an academic electives that hyper-focuses on some type of thing that that special needs student might really enjoy or has a very high capacity for learning. Or you could have something else called a more general elective that doesn't have any academic focus, like PE or art, that just allows a student to be very easily included in something that doesn't have any academic pressure. If there isn't that pressure there, that student isn't going to feel the need to try and perform at the same level as the general education students and therefore be left behind because they simply can't perform at that level. In those two cases, a student can be included naturally because there's nothing holding them back from performing at the same level as the general education students. But, as I said before, special needs students aren't the only ones that are hurt. There is also the problem of teachers. Teachers are not going to be able to teach their best ability, and they are going to be hurt in this classroom as well. There are currently 62,310 teachers in Washington, which seems like a lot at first, but only 11%, or about 6,700 of them, are actually certified to be able to fully teach special education students. So let me paint a picture for you with those numbers in mind. If you try and put a special needs student in every single general education class, you're going to have a problem. You aren't going to have enough teachers fully certified to be able to teach those students. You're going to have teachers that are not certified teaching special needs students as well. So you have a teacher that is not qualified to teach students that has to now teach a class of general education students mixed in with some special education students. But say you're an 11th grade English teacher and you have to teach through Moby Dick. If you are trying to get 4 special needs students who have nowhere near close to the reading level to be able to go through Moby Dick, you are not going to be able to teach them that. That's the simple truth. You will then have to teach the general education students Moby Dick, but also make a whole nother content section for those special needs students. You are basically being asked to do 2 jobs. You have to teach the general education students and the special education students that you are not even qualified in the first place to teach. If you put them in that situation, that's not going to make teachers want to stay and keep working. You're just going to put them in a worse and worse cycle of, oh, I want to quit my job because I'm not being paid well enough, or I have too much work to do, these classes are too hard, I can't do this. You then maybe cause a teacher certified or not even certified, but just a good teacher in general to quit, and then you bring in worse and worse teachers, and it never gets better. That is the problem with full inclusive classrooms for teachers. Now, to go on to the last group that we need to talk about, and that will be the general education students. General education students have seen increased incidents of classroom disruptions from student misconduct, rowdiness outside of the classroom, acts of disrespect towards teachers and staff, and prohibited use of electronic devices, and that is from the National Center of Education Studies. Basically, what's that telling us is that the attitudes and behavior of general education students have been worse post-COVID. Students aren't as ready to learn, they don't have a good attitude towards learning, and they have a worse attitude towards their teachers. That does not mix well for getting students ready to learn the required material they need to learn in a given year. This also couples with the fact that a lot of students are not actually at their grade level for some subjects. Math and English are 2 great examples. There are many, many students in the public school systems that cannot do math or English at the grade level that they are currently at. They are behind in some way. And if you want students to be able to catch up and get back to their age grade level, if they're acting worse and they're less willing to learn, it's going to be really hard to get them there. But that is a pretty general statement. That doesn't account for every single student. So what about the students that maybe want to perform really well in a class, that are ready to hear from the teacher, and they want to be able to get a degree or get an opportunity to go to a great Ivy League school or something along those lines? Well, you are not the first priority for your teacher anymore as that general education student. Even if you are a great student, love the teacher, and the teacher loves you, the teacher in a full inclusive classroom has to focus on the special education student first, because obviously they are going to have more needs than a general education student will. If that is true, then you as that student are going to feel neglected. You aren't going to have as good an opportunity to learn and catch up with your other counterparts in non-general education, full inclusive classrooms. And so if that student might start to feel animosity, maybe even hatred towards that special needs student for being the reason that they can't advance or can't be as good as their counterparts in non-inclusive classrooms. That then takes away from all the reasons they said to put students in an inclusive classroom, because they said, oh, the social benefit will be great. Everyone will love each other, and then you can feel included in those classrooms. If the students are hating each other because their opportunities are hurt and they can't seem to get along or do any of the same work, it's just going to spell disaster for everyone involved. But some people are still going to argue for why special education kids need to be in these general education classrooms. One of the reasons that's most commonly brought up is money. Special education students receive more funding than general education students. And most people think that if you take those special education students and mix them in with the general student body, you're going to have more money that you can spread across to all the students, therefore making the lives of each student in the school better because you're able to spend more money on each individual student. And sadly, that is not the case. It is not going to work. Special education students only get approximately 9.9% more funding than general education students. So if only 13% of the total student body in Washington receive that extra 10%, if you put all of those together and you put that into one big group, it's just going to be an extra little drop of water. It's not going to be anything that really matters. While yes, it might provide some small minuscule benefit, there's not going to be anything of real importance that those students can receive. And in that scenario, you're going to be taking away from the special education students because that extra money that was provided, what it's really used for is buying necessary things for students in special education. Students in special education, they have their own rooms. They usually have their own bathrooms. They have their own desks and chairs depending on the disability. They're going to have assistive learning devices. They might have microphones in the classroom. They might have any number of things that is required to help that special education student best learn. But if they don't get that extra funding and it's not spread across those classrooms evenly, it's not going to work. They aren't going to receive what they need to learn well. You are just throwing them out and telling them that they are just going to have to cope with the fact that they aren't going to get as much anymore. The second argument that people are going to bring up is that there is a huge social benefit in an inclusive classroom that is going to outweigh any educational deficit. And to that, there are two things to say. The first is that as a school, your first job is to educate the students. It's not to give them a better social experience. Your job as a school has to be education first. And while any social benefit can be a good secondary thing that you want to push, it cannot be your first priority. Your job is to educate. That is the job that schools were given, and they cannot take that for granted and just tell special education students their education isn't as important anymore. This social benefit is. That is not the case. Also, it is very, very bold of them to try and say that special education students do not receive any sort of good social benefit in the classes they have right now. Special education students are able to form much better bonds with other kids that are like them. Even though they may not be exactly the same or always share the same interests, special education students make friends with other special education students better because they're able to feel more included easier, and if they're in that contained classroom, they're able to build those bonds better. A great example of this can be my brother Aiden and his friends. Starting from left to right, we have Nicole, Aiden, JT, Caden, Ethan, Catherine, Trent, and Joelle. All of these students either attended school together or were friends of students in this group and attended just a different special education program. In this picture, you can clearly see these are students that are having a great time together. If you put each of these students in a full inclusive classroom, maybe two of them will know each other, maybe, at best case scenario. And all they'd be doing would be suffering together in that general education classroom together because they wouldn't get the same amount of resources that they need to succeed. If they are in that special education classroom together, however, they can be able to grow as friends. They can be able to push themselves to the max of what their abilities can handle, and they can grow and learn together. This also allows for the families of these students to get connected better. If the families are connected, then they'll be able to hang out, more easily go to parties and events such as Night to Shine, which is a great event for special needs students to go to. And so, what are the important things to remember about special education? The most important thing is that special education students need their own place. They cannot be put in general education classrooms and forced to compete with other general education students in a way that they are simply not able to. They have to have their own area where they can be successful and where their needs can be met to the best of their abilities. The proposed dismantling of special education is real. People are pushing for full inclusion. Bills are in the works and they are trying to be passed. To protect special education and those who need it most, this cannot be allowed to happen. We must protect special education for those who need it most so they can continue to grow and succeed. Thank you.
Evan, thank you. So, two-part question. The first question is, help us understand a little bit the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That doesn't require full inclusion, correct?
It does not, no, not in any sense of the word. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, what it requires is for the fair and beneficial treatment of special needs students. It wants students to be protected and have the best ability. It is actually something that works entirely against full inclusion. They are not the ones calling for full inclusion. I believe they are the ones that have put up one of the best defenses against full inclusion.
Okay, so the act itself actually discourages full inclusion.
Yes.
So who's on, when you say bills are in the works and people are advocating for full inclusion, it's a little unclear to me, who's making these arguments? Is it teachers? Is it unions? Is it administrators? Is it the government? Help us paint a little bit of a better picture of who your opponent is in your argument.
Absolutely. So it is a wide range. There are some teachers that believe that full inclusion is the better solution. There are some school districts in total, like the Lake Washington School District, that are practicing full inclusion right now. There are also other politicians that have been involved with special education in the past that believe full inclusion is the right way to move special education forward in the future. So it can range from any of the categories that you listed. There's going to be someone that is pushing for full inclusion at some level. It really depends on the amount, but I think the best example from right here in Washington is for sure the Lake Washington School District. They are practicing that full inclusion model as we speak.
Yeah, Evan, following on that, would you say that the people pushing for it, do they follow along political lines? Like, is it a Democrat versus Republican or conservative liberal issue?
That's not something I've entirely pondered that much, but what I can find is the connection that most of the articles I have read, pardon me, have had more liberal-leaning views tied to the full inclusion movement. And you can also connect that to the fact that inclusion as itself is more of a liberal push in general. When most people are calling for inclusion, they are calling for it from a more liberal standpoint, and so I think that pertains in special education mostly as well.
Do you know how long the Lake Washington School District has practiced full inclusion, and is there any research or documentation on the results of these students, or positive or negative? Has it been years? Has it?
I believe it has been a few years that Lake Washington School District has been practicing full inclusion. And while I don't have a statistic specifically from that district, if we call back to my first confirmation, Jane Sevier, who has done research on full inclusion classrooms, did say that students who are in those inclusive classrooms do perform statistically worse than special education students in special education rooms.
And is the consensus, let me look at her, is that also the general education students in those classrooms also perform worse?
Yes, that is also true as well.
Is that in her research?
That is not in Jane Sevier's research, no.
Okay, where did that information?
That research
I mean, besides your common sense approach, but what?
Besides the common sense approach. I do not have that quote sadly listed on there right now. I cannot bring up a specific number for you. But what I can tell you for certainty is that those students do in fact struggle from that, from being in a full inclusive classroom. Besides the common sense approach, I'm sorry I don't have another statistic for you at the ready, but anyone who thinks about it can know that if you are in that classroom, you are not going to be able to succeed to your full potential, even as a general education student.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you made a point about how there's a shortage of teachers, and that's one of the problems. I would think that having kids in a non-full inclusive environment would require more teachers to have the special ed children separated. But that's not a point that you addressed.
Yes, it is not a point I address because you are able to put more special education kids in that one room. If you're able to centralize more special education kids in one specific area, you are then not going to require as many special education teachers. Because if for a full inclusive classroom in an ideal situation, which I said, you would want to have someone who is fully certified to teach special education students. But if you have to drop the number of students from, let's say, 12 or 15 to 3 or 4, then you're going to have to spread out those teachers much, much more and then run out of them eventually.
So you're saying the full inclusive setup requires more teachers?
It's not going to require more teachers in general, but if you want the special education students to even have a chance and have a special needs, someone who's certified to teach special needs education, you are going to run out faster. Because all those teachers that are in SPED classrooms now are going to have to be spread out and moved to and have to teach less special needs students. So the teacher to student ratio is going to be messed up and changed from 12 or 15 to 1 to 4 to 1. And then obviously you're not going to have enough teachers to be able to make that ratio work.
And is that something that advocates of full inclusion are trying to do?
They are trying to get more teachers certified to be special education teachers, yes, but it's obviously not doing a good enough job. And as I said, even in that situation where even if you have a situation where you have that fully certified teacher, they're not going to be able to make a full inclusion classroom work well, because the general education students and special education students are always going to be learning completely separate things, because they're not going to be able to keep up at the same level. So if you make that teacher have to teach basically 2 classes inside one classroom, it's not going to work out well.
Yeah, and last question, if teachers who want to focus in special education, is there still a place for them in the full inclusion environment?
There is still a place for them, because to get your special education teaching degree, you have to be well-versed in teaching general education students as well. And so, but there isn't really a specific place for them anymore. They're going to just be thrown in the mix of teachers that are going to have to teach those general education and special education mixed classes. So no, there will not be a specific place for them anymore.
Yeah. Thank you.
Evan, your focus obviously is on the 13 to 14% of special education students. I'm wondering about all the other students. It feels to me like there's a real benefit for all the other students when special education students are in the classroom. There are opportunities for the non-special education students to grow and learn, even academically, in different ways. Have you thought about that? What is the detriment by pulling out special education students from the mainstream classroom?
I'm a little confused by your question. So you're saying if I get this right, there is a benefit to having special education students in a classroom full-time for the general education students? Is that correct?
That's my presupposition. Would you disagree with that?
I would.
Okay, so your claim is there is no benefit to the 87%, let's call it. 87% of students who are not in special ed have no benefit, no social benefit, no academic benefit, no emotional benefit by having those other students in their classroom.
Well, while I wouldn't say there is zero benefit, I would say the benefit is outweighed by the deficit that it causes. There is a benefit in that we need general education students to be able to work well with special education students. We want to teach them to be able to interact with students differently from them, be able to make friends with people that aren't the same with them. We want to give them those opportunities to work with those special education students. The problem is, if they are involved in the classroom full time, they're going to hurt the overall education of the general education students. And if those general education students really care about getting the best education possible, that, as I said before in my refutation, that could cause animosity between some of those general education students that want to strive to be better and the special needs students that, by no fault of their own, are holding those general education students back. And so while there might be some benefit to those students interacting for maybe temporary time, in which case I would call for them to be invited to more social events that the school puts on, or electives that don't put that same academic pressure on them, I think them being in the classroom full-time is an overall detriment to both parties.
In the Lake Washington School District or other schools where they do practice full inclusion, do you have any numbers as to what is the percentage of the class that have IEPs? Do they continue to have those IEPs in the classroom?
So the special education students, yes, are going to continue to have their IEPs. They have to. That is the rule by school and by law set by FAPE, which is, may I get a definition from myself, the Free Appropriate Public Education Requirement.
Okay.
Which sets that special education students need to receive an adequate amount, and they have to get a certain good quality amount of education. And so in those full inclusive classrooms, they aren't going to be able to receive that. And the problem is that even if you try your best to be able to include them and meet those IEPs that you set, you're either going to have to set lower IEPs, because if they're not in a special inclusive class, special education inclusive, my apologies, I mixed up two words there. If they are not in a special education classroom full-time, the IEPs are going to have to be lowered, because the special needs students cannot be the full focus of the teacher the full time.
So I know a teacher in the Edmonds School District who has special needs children in her kindergarten classroom, and there is a specialist who, or I assume a certified person, who is managing the IEPs of all those students within her classroom. So they're in the kindergarten classroom with the other students, but they all have IEPs, but there's another teacher there that is managing
Yes.
those students. How common is that? And what, I want to go back to what percentage of students in the Lake Washington School District are in, is it 13% of a class? What does that look like?
I don't have an exact number for each class in the Lake Washington School District. How
Right.
many special
On the
needs students
average.
do you have? But obviously, if they're in a full inclusive setting, there's going to be a couple per class. The numbers can vary depending on the class, and also how many students with maybe higher functioning disabilities there are at that school. And so while it may be able to work well with an aide at a kindergarten level, and you might just need one aide to help manage those IEPs and keep those students in some realm of kind of, I guess, same learning ability as the general education students. If you bring it up to anywhere past probably the 4th, 5th, or 6th grade level, it's going to be very difficult, even if they have that extra help from that aide that can manage IEPs in the classroom, for them to be able to perform at the same level, education-wise, as the general education students.
Do you know if it's common to have an aide that manages the IEPs within the classroom?
Basically depends on how many teachers do you have. And since there's a lack, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes the teacher's going to be left out to dry, and they're going to have to deal with it themselves.
So you're arguing that resources are better used in the SPED classrooms?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'm biased thinking about Providence as we're a parent partnership school, but I'm curious in this setting, like, what do the parents want for their children, or is anybody asking that question?
Yes, many parents are wondering what is really best for their student. If I was a parent, though, and I had a child with special needs, I would want the best for that child in any way, shape, or form. I would want them to be able to go and learn in a classroom where they're going to have the best opportunity to succeed and grow. If I was given the choice between them being in a general education classroom full-time, which means them being neglected some of the time, them not being able to learn the material they need to all the time, and them not being with as many of their peers as they can all the time, I would choose them being in a specified classroom that is built for them to succeed every single day, without a doubt. And so, is there something you want to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, do you know, you make good arguments, and I'm wondering if there are parents out there that are upset about this and are advocating for
So
change.
if you look behind you, there are 3 parents waving their hands at me. They happen to go by the names John and Angie Graham and Mrs. Fisher. And they all quite agree with me here that full inclusion is not the solution for their children with special needs. They believe that the education system we have now is a much, much, much better option for their students. And I wouldn't be here with Mrs. Fisher as my advisor if my brother was not in a special needs classroom that allowed him to meet JT and get involved with those other friend groups. So yes, the parents want the best for their students, and they get the best in those special education classrooms.
Do you know, are there any parents who are pushing for full inclusion, or is this kind of an admin-based non-teacher? I can't imagine teachers pushing for it, so honestly, being a teacher. But is this kind of an admin-based? Where do you see this opposition to it coming from? And are there parents that would push for that?
So funny part about your statement is there are some teachers, surprisingly enough, that do push for it, which I don't seem to understand in the slightest. But also, there are some parents, yes, that want to push for it. And for some parents, it can make more sense than others, because some parents have students with higher functioning disabilities that can spend 80 to 100% of their day in a special education classroom. Or, sorry, my apologies, in a general education classroom. There actually is a statistic that, if you remember that very long and lengthy definition I had at the beginning of what makes a student a special needs student, it has a very broad range of categories. A student with a minor hearing disability could be considered a special needs student, but also a student with profound autism could be. And so since you have that dichotomy, there can be some students that have some special needs but can perform in a general education classroom the rest of the time. There are those parents that could want for full inclusion because they can't see how it affects students with maybe more severe disabilities. They can only see their own student and how it would be best for them to be in a general education full time.
Evan, you talk a little bit about the cost difference, and I think you said, if I remember, 10%. It costs 10% more to educate a special needs student. Is that accurate?
It does not cost 10% more. Schools receive 10% more funding from a general education student.
So it's federal funding. So,
Yes.
So talk a little bit about what the cost differences are to a district or to a taxpayer for inclusion versus special education classes and courses that are built for these students.
If I'm correct, I do not believe there will be any difference taxpayer-wise or money-wise that you're going to have to pay, because even though the students are included, they're still going to be considered special education students, and they're going to keep receiving the same amount of funding. So even though they're in an inclusive setting, everyone's still going to receive the same amount of money. I just don't believe it's going to be applied as well in that full inclusive setting. But the money is going to stay the same when it's coming out of the pockets of taxpayers.
So let's make it a little more specific. I'm curious, you brought up Lake Washington a couple times, and you said they are going with a full inclusion model.
Indeed.
Is that more costly for Lake Washington to go full inclusion, or would it be more costly to follow what you're proposing, and might the costs of what you're proposing be an impediment to the change?
Personally, I believe the change to full inclusion would be more costly, because right now what schools have is they have special education classrooms and facilities for students with special needs all over their schools. And that is something that they currently have. We do not need to buy or add or build onto that. If you want to change to a full inclusion model, you're going to have to wipe out all those classrooms, because obviously you don't need the special education classrooms anymore, and then build new general education classrooms. So if you're going to change all of that, I would say full inclusion is going to cost more just because of the renovation changes you have to make. If you keep the model we currently have in a district that supports special needs students in special needs classrooms, it's not going to cost any extra. The cost will stay the same because they're already doing it right.
I guess I just want to come back to the accountability. I mean, we have this extra money coming from the government. You said 1.8 times or
9.9%.
more than a normal student?
Than a normal student, yes.
Okay. So, it sounds like they're getting a worse education and there's no measurable benefit and it's costing more to do these changes. Like, what actual accountability is there? Is it just the honesty of the therapists writing the IEPs and whether they're, downplaying the issues? Or is there some government agency that comes in to make sure that there's, a good job is being done educating the kids with the extra money they're receiving? Like, what's the accountability system in place from the government?
For full inclusion classrooms?
For the proper education of kids with special needs.
Accountability for the... Can you elaborate a little bit more on
What
you mean by that?
accountability is there on schools that they're doing a good job educating students with special needs?
Well, I think there's a couple levels of accountability. The teacher themselves are going to know if they're educating their students well or not. The aides that are in special education classrooms with the students are going to see if they're receiving the right education or not. And while not every special needs student is going to be able to communicate it well, it can be communicated if they are having a problem with the treatment that they are receiving. And so while it's not always the easiest thing, even my parents, for example, have heard from my brother that, hey, maybe this thing at school today didn't go well and I felt like I was mistreated. While it wasn't communicated as smoothly as that, it was able to be figured out and then addressed by my parents, and then the problem could be later resolved. And so there isn't someone monitoring or watching video in every classroom saying, are you doing a good enough job teaching these special education students? But there is accountability with how many people are in those classrooms, and the students themselves are able to keep it, tell the truth to their parents about what is happening in some cases. And so if all of those work together, I think that's a good enough system of checks and balances that that's all you really need for that accountability.
Just to follow on there, if there is sufficient accountability, then I guess are your arguments being brought up? It sounds like your arguments are being downplayed or not seen by people pushing for full inclusion, but you're saying there is accountability there. So are your concerns being surfaced by that accountability structure?
Sadly, we're out.
Okay. All right.